Hey, kia ora, Helen Brahms here with today's edition, which is April 26th, of Genealogy and History. So, as we're going through these events and everything else, it's always cool to see how the events in history or these people in history relate to your family tree. So, what we're looking for is, you know, any of the people that we mention, any of the events that took place, do they appear anywhere in your family tree? As far as people mentioned, is there a connection to these people in your tree? Or with the events that happened, could your ancestors or somebody in your family tree have been present or participated in these events? We try to pick out the cool, fun ones and some not so well known ones. So, are you ready for April 26th? So, we're going to be going from 1514 through to 1923 today. So 1514 to 1923. Whoo, you ready? Let's rock this. So in 1514, Copernicus makes his first observation of Saturn, of the planet Saturn. Saturn, Saturn, in case anybody didn't understand the accent. So that was back in 1514. Like, wow, when were all the other planets kind of discovered and named? Who named it Saturn? That's what I want to know. Who named it Saturn? That would be really cool to find out. In 1564, on April the 26th, William Shakespeare was baptized in the Stratford upon Avon in Warwickshire, England. He was born 3 days prior to that, so that's 1564. In 1607, Jamestown expedition makes its first landing in America at a place named Cape Henry in what would become Virginia, but they quickly departed for a better site. And what was wrong with the first one? In 1755, the first Russian university opened in Moscow. So, wow, there's a lot of history. I mean, if you think Asia, Europe, and England, Scotland, Ireland, there is a ton of what we in New Zealand would call really old history. I mean, New Zealand's pretty young compared to New Zealand and even Australia are very young countries compared to Asia and Europe. It's just and Scandinavia and England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland. New Zealand and Australia are very, very young countries in comparison. I mean, there's buildings in Europe and Asia and Russia and all that that go back centuries and centuries and centuries. I mean, 1755, the first Russian university opens in Moscow. I'm sort of like, what? It is really hard for me to comprehend at times that when I'm walking into places, like when we were going through Europe on the river cruise from Prague through to Budapest, seeing buildings that were created before New Zealand was even discovered was sort of like, this is unbelievable. Or buildings that were created before New Zealand even really became a nation, or because we didn't sign the Treaty of Waitangi until the 6th of April of 1840. That's how young we are. And that was the agreement between the Maoris and the Europeans on the land deals and all of that sort of thing. So that wasn't signed until 1840. Yes, people have been coming to New Zealand before then, but that was sort of like the treaty that they signed in 1840 for the land use and that sort of thing. And it's, our buildings aren't much. Our buildings are, we start in 1840. You go to like here in Russia, 1755 is when the university opened, which means they had a lot of buildings around before then too. It's mind-boggling at times. In 1777, Sybil Ludington, aged 16, rides 40 miles in New York to warn her father's militia of the approach of the British. Well, that was pretty brave for a 16-year-old girl. In 1848, naturalist, biologist, and explorer Alfred Russel Wallace departs the UK for South America, beginning 4 years of travel, collecting, and researching in the region. Wouldn't that be fun? You're going into imagine being an explorer. You're going into completely uncharted territory. You don't know what's going to be there. You don't know who you're going to meet. You don't know what the locals are going to be like. And you're going in there just to explore what cultures are down there, to explore the plant life that are down there, the wildlife that's down. and you have no idea what you're going to be meeting when you get there. Can you imagine that? And imagine these guys, these explorers who set sail to go and see if they could find these distant lands and things. They could end up just, and at that time, a lot of them thought the world was flat, so they thought they were going to go to the edge of the world and then just drop off. Can you just imagine around that time when all these explorers are going out there discovering new lands and bringing them back to to kings and queens and something, or claiming lands for different countries and things. Can you just imagine what it's like? You're basically going into the great unknown. It's just awesome. What was that? 1887, Huntsville Electric Company forms to sell electricity. In 1904, Bell Telephone Company of Antwerp, Belgium forms. This was one of the first telephone companies. In 1906, motion pictures began regular showings at the Orpheum Theatre in Honolulu, Hawaii. In 1920, Harlow Shapley and Herbert D. Curtis hold the great debate on the nature of nebulae, galaxies, and the size of the universe at the U.S. National Academy of Sciences in Washington, D.C. Could you imagine being there in 1920 and you're talking about the biggest great unknown, the space exploration, space and exploration and stuff, and we hadn't even been out to the stars. It's just whatever we had seen, through telescopes and things, and and as they're starting to learn all of this, it's just incredible. On this day in 1923, English Prince Albert Frederick Arthur George, the Duke of York, married Lady Elizabeth Angela Margarita Bowes-Lyon at Westminster Abbey. And you're probably going, who the heck are these people? Otherwise known as the parents of Queen Elizabeth II, and Prince Albert later on became on December the 11th, 1936, is when Prince Albert became King George VI, is the day that his brother Edward VIII abdicated the throne so that he could marry Wallace Simpson. And that's when all that started. And then George VI went on to pass away from cancer, and there was something else in there, lung cancer, and I can't remember what the other thing was. It was two things. And he died on the 6th of February, 1952, and that is when Queen Elizabeth II ascended the throne. So just to give you a little royal history in there, that's when it all started. And next year, February 6th, it'll be 70 years since she ascended the throne, and it'll be June 2023 when it'll be 70 years since her coronation, because it was over a year before she was coronated. Which will mean also 70 years since Sir Edmund Hillary conquered Mount Everest, because it all happened around the same time. The coronation and Sir Edmund Hillary conquering Mount Everest all happened around that same time. If I remember correctly, it was the day of the coronation that the news came. It's either the day of or the day before the coronation when the news came through that Sir Edmund Hillary had stepped foot on the peak of Mount Everest. So just a little trivia for you that'll be coming up in June. In 1928, Madame Tussauds waxwork expedition reopened in London after a fire. Have you ever been to any of her museums and things? I haven't been inside any of them, but I've been past a couple of them where they had a couple of the statues on display. Was it Prague? Yeah, Prague on their museum seemed to have like a display at the entrance that was inside the museum, but in the lobby. But the lobby was like wide open, or you'd walk through a little door into a courtyard. Like I remember there was one on Torture, I think it was. Was it Torture it was on? And you looked through this archway into the courtyard of the Torture Museum in Prague, and there were these 4 giant handguns pointing towards a statue in the middle, and no, they were pointing at each other. That's right, they were pointing at each other. There wasn't anything in between. They were pointing at each other, and I was sort of like, yeah, I wouldn't want to be the first one to pull the trigger on that one. Talk about a tense situation. But if you had somebody standing in the middle of all of that, all they needed to do was duck. the moment that he saw a finger twitch, all he needed to do was duck, and people would start shooting each other. Yeah, and that was before you got to the door of the museum. There was one. Pretty sure there was one in Prague where they had a couple of the displays out there as you walk into the lobby area. But they were pretty good. They were pretty good. In 1954, mass trials of Jonas Salk's anti-polio vaccine begins. The first shot is delivered in Fairfax County, Virginia. More than 443,000 children received shots over 3 months. Fairfax County, I lived there for 13 years. When I first got to the States, the first place I lived was Fairfax County. So that's when all the polio vaccinations were taking place. In 1957, Jamestown, Virginia, had the 350th anniversary festival opened to celebrate the first landing in America at Jamestown, at Cape Henry. So if you remember, we talked about in 1607 how the Jamestown expedition made its first landing in America at a place named Cape Henry, and then they went off and found somewhere else. So 350 years later, in 1957, so that was 1957, so they've already had the 400th anniversary of that, because if you think that's 1957, 50 years later is 2007, so they've already had the 400th anniversary of that. Add on another 10 years, they've had the 410th anniversary of that. So they're making these milestone leaps. I mean, it's kind of a little mind-boggling. In 1962, the first Lockheed A-12 flies. And I thought, Lockheed A-12, that sounds like a military aircraft of some sort. It was actually a high-altitude Mark III Plus reconnaissance aircraft that was built for the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, and they retired it in 1968. And I was having a look at it, and it kind of reminded me of some of the later aircrafts that came along, some of the bombers and stuff that came along. And it was a pretty fast aircraft. I mean, when you think Mark plus Mark III, so like that's fast. That's fast. And that was in, what year did I say? 1962. Also on the same day in 1962, the US and United States and the United Kingdom launched Ariel 1, which was the first international payload going into space, and it was for the United Kingdom's first satellite to be launched. That was in 1962. On April 26, 1967, San Marco 2 was launched. It was the first equatorial launch, which means it was very close to the equator, and it was launched by an Italian crew from a platform anchored in Formosa Bay in the Indian Ocean. And it was like 10 miles off the coast of Kenya, if I remember what I read correctly. It wasn't that far off the coast of Kenya. And it was like 2 point something degrees latitude. Yes, latitude. Remember, latitude lays across, and longitude measures the length. Yes, remember. 1976, Pan Am began non-stop flights from New York City to Tokyo. I was like, okay, did they go New York City across the US to get to Tokyo, or did they go New York City around Europe? That would have been a very long way to go. So I'm assuming that they went New York City across the US, across the Pacific to Tokyo that way. Interesting to go and have a look and see. In 1982, Argentina surrenders to Great Britain on South Georgia Islands near the Falkland Islands, and that signaled the end of the Falkland Wars. I remember that vividly. I remember the nightly news reports about that. I remember how they were saying Buckingham Palace was concerned because the Queen's son, Prince Andrew, was actually flying helicopters down there in the Falkland Wars. So she was concerned about his safety and everything while he was down there. In 1986, the fourth reactor at Chernobyl nuclear plant in the USSR exploded. 31 were killed, and radioactive contamination reached much of Western Europe. I remember that too. 1986, I would have been in Wigram when that happened. In the RNZ, I was in the Royal New Zealand Air Force at the time. In April? Was I on my senior course or getting ready to go? I think I was getting ready to go on my senior course. I think my senior course was in June. But I remember being in the Royal New Zealand Air Force at the time when that happened. In 1992, ABC aired the final episodes of both Growing Pains and Who's the Boss. And on that same day in 1992, remember I told you we're finishing in 1992, so not only did ABC air but the final episodes of both Growing Pains and Who's the Boss, on that day in 1992, the Ellis Island Medal of Honor was posthumously awarded to Alex Haley, the well-known author of Roots and also the autobiography of Malcolm X. And that was in 1992. So that there ends, and I went, Ellis Island had a Medal of Honor, and I went in there, and it was pretty cool what they award it for every year. And I should have written it all down, but I didn't. But go Google it, the Ellis Island Medal of Honor, and go Google what it's all about. It's pretty cool about how what it covers as far as learning not only your own culture, but what you contribute to the country as a whole. And you don't actually have to be born in the US in order to get it either. But go check out Ellis Island's Medal of Honor. It's a pretty cool reward. So that's all the stuff that all the fun stuff that happened on this day through the years from 1514 to 1992. Go check your genealogy. Have a look at your family history. Did anybody that we were mentioned, do they appear somewhere in your family tree? What about the events? Do you remember some of those events that occurred, especially some of the later ones? Do you remember any of those occurring? Do you know of stories of family members who may have been involved in some of the events that took place, or may have watched the news about it or read about it and told their version of it, where they were when it happened and that sort of thing? So, or what life was like during that time, and how that event may have changed their lifestyle after that. Did it have any impact on their life? Did it not have any impact on their life? It's always interesting to go back and find out. But anyway, that's it from us for today for Genealogy and History. Tune in tomorrow around 12:15 for April 27th. Hei konera.